Due to its combination of climate and vegetation, southeast Victoria is one of the most fire-prone environments in the world. High temperatures, low humidity and low rainfall in many areas, combined with constant fuel accumulations made up of leaves, bark, twigs and logs, make conditions for fire ideal. Wind, airborne ambers from bark and volatile oils in the leaves of eucalypts also promote the spread of fire. At its fiercest, fire can be a devastating and destructive force. In the last 100 years in Victoria, there have been a number of wildfires that have caused widespread damage to property and life. Most notably, the fires of Black Friday in 1939, Ash Wednesday in 1983, and the 2003 Alpine fires have left a profound impact on the people of Victoria. By undertaking fire prevention and suppression operations, the Department of Sustainability and Environment, Parks Victoria and the Country Fire Authority ensure that the impacts of wildfire on the people of Victoria are minimised. The ecological effects of fire on the environment can also be very profound. The images of a blackened and scarred landscape are often seen as the end result of a powerful and destructive natural force. But just as it has done for millions of years, the native vegetation uses fire as an ideal opportunity to begin a new process of regeneration and renewal. And soon after the fire is out, signs of new life are already beginning. As a fire moves through the landscape, the organic matter that is bound up in the living vegetation and the smaller leaves, twigs, bark and other dead matter found mainly on the ground is burnt at a very high temperature. This produces ash that is found all over the landscape soon after the fire front has passed through. Because of this process, previously inaccessible plant nutrients become readily available for the new life that will begin. This flush of accessible nutrients combine with several other factors to produce an ideal environment for the flora to regenerate. There is greater sunlight penetration caused by the reduced canopy overhead, and the autumn rains that usually follow soon after the bushfire season provide water. There is also a reduction in the number of mature plants competing for resources, as well as reduced pressures from animals grazing and browsing on the vegetation. As the managers of public land in Victoria, the Department of Sustainability and Environment and Parks Victoria work cooperatively to ensure that fire suppression and prevention are given the highest priority, as well as making sure that the ecological benefits of fire are maximised. And they will now take you on a tour of the two most recent and influential fires of the past few years.
Hi, my name's Ryan. I'm a ranger here at Wilsons Promontory National Park. Earlier this year, on the 1st of April, a fire burnt about 13% of the park. Today, we're going to be looking at how the prom has recovered since, and in particular, different strategies that plants use to recover after fire. So as you can see behind me, the grass trees are beginning to flower with their tall flowering spikes. Something we noticed after the fire were the grass trees are one of the first plants to recover. Fire is an event that promotes a mass flowering amongst grass trees, and that's what's happening behind me at the moment. Although this mature hakea has died after the fire has stimulated its seed pods to open, releasing the seeds to the nutrient-rich ash bed below for the next generation to arise. Due to the nutrient-rich ash bed and increased exposure to light, we can already see the new generation of hakeas is beginning to emerge. Different eucalypt trees respond in different ways to fire. As we can see beside me, we've got some epicormic growth upon a stringy bark eucalypt. As the fire passed through, the bark protects the buds beneath. Once the canopy is burned out, it promotes the growth of these epicormic shoots. From a blackened landscape, one of the plants that surprisingly rapidly recover are tree ferns. Their fresh green fronds bring colour back to the landscape, and as you can see behind me, many of the tree ferns have recovered since the recent fire. As you have seen, plants have returned after the recent fire. A unique opportunity exists for visitors to return and witness the recovery of Wilsons Promontory National Park.
Yeah, g'day, I'm Glenn Johnson. I'm with the Department of Sustainability and Environment based in Wodonga. So we're here in the northeast, and right at this moment we're in Chiltern Pilot National Park. We're going to look today at the response to the Alpine fires. So this area was a little bit of an outlier to the great Alpine fires of January 2003, and this area suffered a very severe fire in the mid-end of January, and it was a particularly intense fire. It raced up to the top of this summit area with granitic outcropping vegetation, really dry forest, and it was incredible intensity and flame heights. And the response to the vegetation we'll look at today, and one of the things that's really interesting, as has been shown by some post-fire monitoring, is the relationship to hard seed-coated vegetation being able to get their cue to be able to germinate. But it's interesting to look at what are the factors that are determining how and why things come back, and the principal thing is that we've had almost an absolute total canopy reduction. So there's none of the usual shading events. In this instance, with the native peas, as shown by the Pultoneers, the bush peas here, and certainly the wattles, which are well represented in the park again now, is the ability for them to make use of the availing circumstances. So we've got plenty of sunshine, we've got a rich potash bed, which has got a local supply of nutrients right at the soil interface. There's no competition whatsoever from any overstory vegetation or understory vegetation, and importantly the seed bed, and principally these hard seed coated species, have been cued. Their seed coat has been cracked by the intensity of the fire, and some would say the combination of smoke, the ethylene from the fire, that chemical response together with opening up of the seed coat has cued the seed, and they've got this warm, nutrient rich seed bed, which when we get the first autumn rains, which eventually did come following the drought, they were cued ready to go. And it's not only the seedbed material, we've got a lot of tuberous species, so a little bit like the native versions of daffodils and jonquils, a whole range of tuberous species which have got underground storage organs like the lilies and the orchids, and a whole range of other wildflower species were able to utilise that situation where they had no competition relatively after the fire. So it's really a valuable exercise in recognising that fire is part of the natural environment and it can be used in a positive sense, and indeed many species are absolutely reliant on that fire cycle for their regeneration and existence in the situation. Yeah, we've got a great example here of this early post-fire colonisation of some of the leguminous species. So in this instance we've got a varnish wattle, and it's like the other vegetation here in the third year post-fire. So it's the third spring, and the species in the foreground, which is the nodding blue lily, together with the wattle, and there's many other species of wattle in this area, are almost at their prime. It's only 3 years, probably the fourth year post-fire in this instance for these species, and they'll probably be at their peak flowering and therefore peak seeding period. They're able to actually provide a really important role in the longer term ecology of the forest. For species like this native pine in the foreground, which, like its cousins, are only relatively small and a long time off their maturation and flowering and seed setting. It's some decade or so before they even start that process, and these longer lived species are in part reliant on this post-fire response of these leguminous species, enabling the soil to actually start to accumulate a greater amount of nitrogen that otherwise is fairly lacking in these Australian soils. So the native legumes work in that manner to, by the benefit of a root association with a bacteria, rhizobium, they're able to fix atmospheric nitrogen, which means they're actually making fertiliser from the air. These guys are able to make up for the lack of nitrogen in the soils by accumulating it through this bacterial association. In the long term, with the decline of the species and the leaf fall from these and other plants, there's an ability to make an environment more desirable for these longer lived species, and they're the climax situation in this type of a forest here. Well, the beauty of this post-fire situation shows that Australian flora is really well adapted to fire, and its ability to regenerate is greatly shown in this instance. Whereas once upon a time we didn't have a great diversity in the ground flora and the shrub layer, now we've got a fantastic array of ground flora shrubs, from grevilleas, bush peas, parrot peas, through to the purple nodding lilies, and then into the understory components with wattles, and there's dogwoods and a whole range of mid-layer species that were not really evident and certainly not abundant prior to the fire. And then we've got this regenerating canopy component that's going to definitely fill out the overstory component. So it's really illustrative of the ability for native vegetation to respond to fire and to create that structural and vegetative floristic diversity, which is fantastic from a range of faunal species, which maximise the value of and ability to utilise these early age classes of vegetation. So we've got a great capacity to have, as we can hear now, lots more birds in the environment that make hay while the sun shines in terms of this flowering and nectar source. Well, the native pine veteran behind me is a ghost of the past, perhaps. It's illustration of the dominance of the black cypress pine in this Mount Pilot environment prior to the fire, but it's a foreteller of the future also. The capsules which you can see behind me on that old veteran were the storehouse for the seed which has provided this regeneration pulse that's come through post-fire. So its strategy has been to hold the seed in hard capsules and release them following the fire into the ground where there's a desirable ash bed. And within this broader landscape, and particularly the outcrops that we can see behind, there's that successional stage starting to occur. So at the moment, whilst there's a apparent eucalypt flush that's dominating this early fire post-fire scenario, in the end, the longer term future of these forests will be that once again the native calitris pines will be the dominant feature of those rocky outcrops.
G'day, my name's Tim Wearne. I work in fire management with the Department of Sustainability and Environment. I'm standing here at Mount Buffalo, which was burned in the 2003 Great Alpine Fires. Behind me you can see the alpine ash. These species use the same regeneration processes as the calitris pine, which was explained by Glenn Johnson earlier. And what happens is there's an en masse post-fire seed release from capsules that are stored up in the canopy. So the fire comes through and it burns out the canopy, and at the same time the heat from the fire stimulates these capsules to release all these seeds into the soil. The result of that is these seedlings that I'm standing next to here. And you can see that they're already about 4 or 5 feet high, and given enough time, these individuals will once again become the dominant overstory species. So what's interesting to note here is that although these mature trees have died, they still serve a purpose in this environment. Even while they're still standing, they'll create even more hollows, which will become vital habitat for a range of faunal species. And when they do eventually fall over, the decomposition process that takes place will provide organic matter back into the soil. And this is a really important component of the long-term ecology of this environment. Behind me is an example of some bush that's been burnt in a mosaic pattern. Burning patterns depend on things such as air temperature, wind speed and direction, aspect, vegetation type, and several other factors. So where some areas might be completely burnt out, other areas remain relatively intact. This is important for the fauna as a refuge area during the fires, as well as providing food and shelter while the burnt out areas begin the regeneration process. So we've seen previously that eucalypts use several methods of regeneration after fire, and here's another one shown by this snow gum. Snow gums and other mallee eucalypts use what are known as lignotubers. These are found underneath the soil surface right at the base of the tree. Within these lignotubers are a whole bunch of stems which are stimulated to grow after the canopy is burnt out. And in time, these stems will replace the canopy that was lost by the fire. Here I am down in the Alpine bogs. These areas are really sensitive to disturbance, but as you can see, even this place has responded well since the fires. Got all manner of grasses and herbs and forbs, heathy species which are well adapted to fire, and also the fire intolerant species such as your sphagnum moss are usually well protected by these waterways. So although the initial images of a blackened landscape after a fire may appear to have negative impacts on the environment, the native plants of southeastern Australia actually use fire as an ideal opportunity for regeneration and renewal. And in fact, plant communities often depend on fire for their long-term survival. So I'm now standing in the magnificent Otway Ranges. In many ways, this area typifies the sort of situation the Victorians all around the state face in relation to living with the threat of wildfire. Here we have a fairly typical eucalypt-dominated forest that once alight, under the right fire weather conditions, could become a real threat to those who live nearby. So how do we as a department, and you as the communities living in these areas, deal with this threat? Well, stick around and we'll show you how.
For many thousands of years, southeastern Australia has experienced wildfires, and it needs to be acknowledged and understood that wildfire in Victoria will continue to be a naturally occurring event that is impossible to completely prevent. These days, in an average summer, around 600 wildfires occur in Victoria's parks and forests. The recent fires in Canberra in 2003 are a prime example of how communities can be badly affected by wildfire. These and other events, such as the 1983 Ash Wednesday and the 2003 Alpine fires, show us that both government agencies and the wider community need to take a share of the responsibility for the protection against the effects of wildfire. The Department of Sustainability and Environment, known as DSE, has the primary responsibility to manage fire on public land and ensure that the impacts of wildfire on people and the landscape are minimised. They do this by allocating a great deal of resources into training for firefighting and support staff and obtaining a vast array of support machinery such as tankers, slip-on units, bulldozers, helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. It is not only about wildfire suppression, it is also about sustaining our natural environment. Research has shown that there are many positive ecological effects that fire has on our native vegetation and wildlife. DSE is committed to applying the knowledge gained from this valuable research, which they now use to further enhance their approach to wildfire preparedness. One of the greatest tools that can be used in the suppression and prevention of wildfire is the forging of strong, long-lasting relationships. DSE recognises this and has developed relationships with other land management agencies such as the Department of Primary Industries, Parks Victoria, local government and the catchment management authorities, as well as working in partnership with the Country Fire Authority on wildfire suppression and community fire education. To further complement these relationships, the ability to work with the wider community is seen as vitally important. By working with and informing local communities, DSE seeks to ensure that the people of Victoria are well prepared to deal with the threat of wildfire. To further enhance this level of preparedness, individuals exposed to the risk of wildfire need to take precautionary action. These actions include understanding and complying with fire restriction regulation that prevents occurrences of unplanned fires, having an understanding of the risk of fire in their area and how fire may impact on their communities, developing self-reliance and the appropriate preparedness to enable them to deal effectively with the threat of fire, having a well-defined bushfire survival plan, including a decision about whether they are willing and able to stay and defend a prepared property or to leave before threatened by fire and road travel becomes hazardous. Being aware of how to access information during times of emergency and know how to respond effectively if threatened by fire. Understanding how lack of periodic fire increases risk to community and the environment. Understand that if they live in, holiday or visit fire-prone areas, they must recognise the risk and take responsibility. While local government and the CFA asks that you, as a land occupier, manage and minimise your own fire risks, DSE and Parks Victoria do their part by undertaking annual prescribed burning operations. Prescribed burning is essentially the controlled use of fire in an area within specified environmental conditions or prescriptions. These prescriptions are determined by the planned objectives, whether they are for asset protection, strategic buffers, ecological management, or regeneration of logging coops. The experience of DSE over many years has shown that the planned use of fire in strategic parts of our parks and forests can provide a degree of security from wildfire. Whilst DSE acknowledges that the smoke effects from prescribed burning can cause some discomfort for some individuals and interfere with tourist operations and events, it should also be understood that these effects are not as great as the impacts that wildfire can have on a community. DSE and Parks Victoria will always consider these effects in order to minimise social and economic impacts. However, the nature of prescribed burning and the limitations imposed on the operations due to environmental and climatic factors means that there is often a very limited window of opportunity in which to carry out the burns.
I'm standing here with Grant Tucker. Grant's a Natural Resource Management Officer with DSE, with a large responsibility in fire management. We're standing in an area that underwent a fuel reduction burn in October of 2004. The following January, a wildfire came through this area, and it was because of this burn that the further spread of the wildfire was prevented. So Grant, can you explain what happened here?
Yes, no worries, Tim. I'm standing here in a DSE managed forest. The forest is managed out of the Casterton Work Centre. This particular section of the forest is designated on our fire protection plan as a Zone 2. Zone 2 is essentially designed as a fuel reduction zone to help us stem the spread of wildfire. In this instance, my crews implemented this burn in October of 2004. In January of 2005, a lightning strike went to ground approximately 4 kilometres to my northeast. Subsequently, the lightning strike turned into a wildfire. The wildfire travelled, as I say, 4 kilometres this direction, jumped the Mount Gambier Road just over here, jumped a power line break and was spitting embers into this area behind me here. Essentially, this area behind me here was fuel reduced to a point that the wildfire couldn't take hold, it couldn't spread any further, and we were able to pull it up. If we hadn't pulled up the fire at this point here, with the help of this fuel reduction burn, it could have potentially spread into significant plantation resources to the back of this forest. There's also farmhouses and hay sheds, and predictions suggest that it may even have reached the town of Digby. I'm standing here on the other side of the burn, the southern side of the same burn. And I just wanted to demonstrate to you another advantage of our fuel reduction burning. We also aim to achieve ecological outcomes along with fuel reduction burning. This area here is heavily infested by pine wildlings. They're essentially plantation escapees. We've got plantations all around the bush here. These have established and will eventually seed themselves and take over the native plants, therefore reducing the biodiversity in this area. By implementing a burn on this side of the road, and we'll have a look over here, we've actually managed to significantly reduce the pine wilding infestation. This side of the road was the same as the other side of the road pre-burn, and on top of the fuel reduction outcome, we've had an ecological outcome and reduced those wildings.
So although fire is a real and persistent threat to the people and assets of Victoria, DSE, in conjunction with its partner organisations, and most importantly with the help of the people of Victoria, is able to manage this threat in a way that means all Victorians are better prepared for wildfire and can still live in and enjoy this magnificent bushland.